Okay, so I'm about to ask a kind of sensitive question, but it's something that we can all probably relate to slash applies to us, unfortunately. But I'm about to ask, so have any of you guys ever been partaken in, seen, or been affected by racial prejudice? Probably a lot of us, which is a very unfortunate thing to say. But that brings me to my next question, which is, are we even registered to vote? Like, are you registered or are you even an active voter? These two things may not seem like they correlate at all, but I'm here to tell you exactly why they do today. So, according to the Pew Research Center, the Census Bureau reported that 245.5 million Americans are actually eligible to vote, which is a majority of our population in this country. But only 136.8 million Americans voted in the 2016 election. That's only 55.7% of a voter turnout rate, which is much lower than a lot of other countries in the world. And I think we as Americans were given the right to vote, so we should actively, if we want to see systematic change, we should actively vote against that racism and racist acts and racism. So that brings me kind of like as an active voter, like I always like to research and figure out why and like what my candidates are for, if they're fighting for human rights or if they even have or seek justice in a broken system. And that kind of is what motivates me to vote for that person. So today we're going to go over a few points today as to like why this is such an important discussion and topic. So we're going to go over first like why racism is still very much alive and well today and how that actually looks in our country as well. And then we're going to kind of dive into the fact that how we can combat these issues and we can like change that and how we have that power to make that change. And then the third point, we're kind of visualize like what that would look like for us in America if we all were to collectively and actively seek out change and what that could mean for us in the future. So let's start with our first main point and go and dive in the fact that racism is very much alive today. Yes, it is 2020 and a lot of us think racism is dead, but it's really not. In all honesty, it's evolved into the modern day society instead through institutionalized racism. I bet a lot of you guys are like wondering what that means, but basically, in a nutshell, it means that systematic oppression, which is something that is put onto minorities, is passed off as people doing their jobs in modern-day society. So a great example of this is the injustice of police brutality on minorities currently in this country. We all know it. We've all seen it on social media. We've seen the videos. We've seen everything, and we are actively working towards reforming our police system because of that. But however, a lot of these officers are not getting convicted for these wrongful murders of these minorities because of the fact that they have policies that protect their lethal force. So according to the use and abuse of police power in America, the historical milestones and current controversies, officers are actually given autonomy when deciding when to use lethal force, as long as it's in with their policy guidelines. And in fact, in a court case with Graham versus Connor in 1989, new language is actually introduced in the lethal force policy, such as, quote, objectively reasonable, which means that what is reasonable based on the facts and circumstances and not the intent and motivation of the officers, which actually kind of helps us in a little bit as people and citizens. But however, they added another clause as well that even had a statement of, quote, the totality of circumstances, meaning that the conditions known by the officer when making decisions in how and when to use force. This gives them more autonomy in when to use that lethal force and like invites in subjectivity to like when that's an okay thing to do and allows for racial bias and prejudice to like come into play there, which is institutionalized racism. Another great example of what that is due to implicit bias towards whites and institutionalized racism, Black people and other minorities are disproportionately represented in the workforce still to this day. Yes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did actually protect workers against overt racial bias in the workplace, but that does not mean that that is completely dead in that. So according to the book of Racism and Justice, because whites are disproportionately occupy elected government office, especially more powerful positions, Blacks suffer from widespread use of political patronage and the distribution of government jobs. And this kind of means that like through like white neighborhoods, and most of them are like in suburbs, kind of affluent areas, more protected, safer environments. And that's how a lot of people get their jobs, is through social networking. And a lot of this happens in those neighborhoods, which is where a lot of these executives and other people in power live, and they're predominantly white. But thanks to redlining in the 1930s, A lot of minorities have actually been secluded into more poor and more dangerous neighborhoods, making them put at a disadvantage towards getting social networking and other jobs for themselves. So I have a solution. Now that we've talked about how racial disparity and institutionalized racism runs rampant in our country, let's talk about our solutions, what we can do as Americans. The United States has a constitution that states our First Amendment right is the freedom of speech, assembly, press, and the right to petition. So we need to use that freedom to facilitate systematic change within our country, right? So we as Americans need to be proactive in creating change instead of just complaining about what change we need to make. So we, as Americans, have the right to petition. So we need to petition against racist acts that we see and do, or not do, but see, and use our voice and our human right to change that. We need to actively research and vote for the candidates that are about to go into office on the national, state, and even county level. And that will help us in itself, because we need to vote for people that are for us and not against us. We hold the power to make a change, so I think it's in our nature that we need to make that change. Ira Katz Nelson states in Geneva Cobbs Moore's book of Bodily Evidence, Racism, Slavery, and Maternal Power in the Novels of Toni Morrison, what a handful, Ira states, much of the Negro community is buried under a blanket of history and circumstance. It's not a lasting solution, just lift one corner of the blanket, but we must all stand on all sides and raise the entire cover if we are able to liberate our fellow citizens. She is saying that we cannot just have the Black community pushing for their rights. We all need to collectively be there and stand up for those people, because we have that power to make that change, so we should. And that kind of brings me to my last point. Like, we talked about like how we can combat that, and like if we all collectively did this thing to abolish racism, our country could very well be in a world, and we live in a world where Americans feel represented, empowered, and heard. So many people, unfortunately, though, they do not vote because they believe their vote doesn't count, and the oppressor will just win anyway. So if we all collectively have this feeling that our vote doesn't count, then no, our vote won't count. And that is letting the opponent get the satisfaction knowing that they're going to win anyway because we're not voting. And in fact, many politicians actually rely on non-voters because at the end of the day, it's one less vote against them and vice versa. So it's a vote for them. Don't let them have that satisfaction. Fight for your voice and to be heard, whether that be through voting, calling your senator or congressman, writing your grievances to city council, or even standing up for yourself in the workplace. So that kind of brings me down like to how all this boils down. Our voter turnout rate, it's kind of low. It could be better, and we need to strive to be better as Americans and using our suffrage and our right to vote to abolish that racist act and racism as a whole. So it's no secret racism is still alive, and it's only evolved in the modern day society. However, we as Americans hold the power to facilitate that change thanks to our First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, press, assembly, and right to petition. Therefore, we should make that change by actively voting against racism and speaking out on it and writing to individuals and empower demanding change and what that change looks like. If we as Americans all collectively take this stand, then we may very well be on our way to a country where everyone feels represented, empowered, and heard. So I encourage you all to stand up and fight for a change. Vote when you can. Today, actually in Oklahoma voters, we have an election today. Go to ok.gov to look and see where your polling place is if you're registered to vote, / even register now if you haven't. And if we all do this and we all one letter and one vote or even one petition doesn't seem like a lot, but if we all come together collectively as a whole and do this, some difference will be made and will be heard and seen. Thank you.